Okay, I'll take that as my cue to start. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I'm sure I've met some of you, but not all of you. I'm John Gill, I'm editor of Times Higher Education, and I'm hugely grateful to all of you for joining this roundtable discussion, particularly grateful to Michael and colleagues at Huawei for bringing us together. We've had a long partnership with Huawei, as I know many universities have too. And huge thanks, Michael, for supporting today's conversation. Just some basic housekeeping before we start. This discussion isn't being broadcast, but it will be featured in a write-up on THE over the next few days. So it's a round table in the true sense of the word, just without a table. But great to have you all here. We do have a title to guide the conversation over the next 90 minutes. You'll have seen it on the slide a moment ago, but just to repeat it, it's Towards a Place-Based Strategy for UK Science and Innovation, how can universities and industry support the levelling up agenda in Scotland? And as I say, we have a fantastic group of people around the table today. I'm going to start by asking each of you just to briefly introduce yourselves first, and then we're going to hear some opening remarks, opening provocations from Stephen Ingledew, who is CEO of FinTech Scotland, and who has very kindly agreed to kick things off and give us a bit of a grounding for the conversation which follows. But if I could just perhaps direct around the group, and you'll all just give us a very brief introduction so we're all familiar with one another. Dave Robertson, you're on my screen first, so I'll come to you.
Okay, so I'm Dave Robertson. I'm a professor in informatics at Edinburgh University, and currently I am the head of science and engineering at Edinburgh. Also run the Scottish node for health data research UK and the applied analytics theme. Great,
thank you, Dave. Brian Williams.
Morning all. I'm from Edinburgh Napier University. I've got a couple of roles there. I'm the head of our research structures for the university, starting to set up some new interdisciplinary institutes and centres, but I'm also the head of health and social care sciences as well, with a broad public health services research background.
Great, thanks, Brian. Tim Bedford.
Hi, I'm Tim Bedford. I'm the Associate Principal for Research and Innovation at the University of Strathclyde. In my night time, I'm a management science researcher on risk management and decision making.
Thank you. I'll come now to Derek Craig.
Sorry, the mute button failed me again. Derek Craig, I am the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council's Head of Regional Engagement for Scotland, a representative of UKRI, as I imagine that's why I've been invited, but primarily focused on the engineering and physical sciences.
Great, thank you, Derek. John Rowan.
Good morning, colleagues. I'm John Rowan. I'm Vice Principal for Research, Knowledge Exchange and Wider Impact at the University of Dundee. In my former life, I was an environmental scientist, environmental change person.
That's great. James Brodie.
Morning, everyone. I'm James Brodie. I'm the Commercial Director for the Industrial Economy at the China-Britain Business Council. Prior to that, I was the Regional Director for Scotland and Northern Ireland for China-Britain Business Council for the last 8 years.
Thank you, James. Michael, let's come to you.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Hill-King. Many familiar faces as well as some new faces on the screen for me this morning. I'm Collaboration Director at Huawei, and my job is to essentially help people like you and your universities work with my colleagues. We currently fund more than 30 universities in the UK, including many in Scotland, and I've put up my picture behind me, which is from last month. And there's a bonus point for anyone who can recognise exactly where it's from by the end of the session.
I think you deserve more than a point for that. That's a tough challenge.
You're not Scottish, John. You can't take part.
Thank you, Michael. Judith Phillips.
Hi, everyone. I'm Judith Phillips, Deputy Principal for Research at Stirling University, which is my backdrop. And I'm a Professor of Gerontology there. My background's in environmental gerontology. So looking at the environmental impact on ageing and vice versa. And I'm the UKRI Research Director for the Healthy Ageing Challenge.
Great, thanks Judith. Brad?
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Brad Mackay, Senior Vice Principal and Vice Principal International Strategy and External Relations at St. Andrews, and a very occasional Professor of Strategy in the Management School. Nice to meet you all.
That's great. Thank you very much. I have Matthew Jackson on the screen as well, and I'm wondering whether I should be asking Matthew to introduce himself or not.
I'm just going to say a very quick hello. I work for Huawei Academic Relations, so it's very nice to meet you all, but I'm not going to be taking part. I'm just an observer.
Great. Have I missed anyone? Or is that's the group? Brilliant. In that case, Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you. I haven't asked you to introduce yourself. I'm sure you will as you make your remarks, but thanks again for getting things started for us. Over to you.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Delighted to see some friendly faces I know and some new faces as well. So I'm Stephen Ingledge. I'm actually the Executive Chair now of FinTech Scotland, which I established 3.5 years ago, back at the beginning of 2018. But I've got a couple of other roles, hats that I wear, I should mention. I sit on the UK government's Innovation Expert Group, which is helping the development of the new innovation strategy, which is due out imminently, as you're probably aware, which is, I think, hugely exciting, and maybe certainly something may come up in this conversation. I've been spending a few days in Scottish enterprise over recent months, which will come to an end of July, helping with them development around the future economy, in shaping really where intervention should take place from an economic agency going forward across all parts of the economy. And I've just taken on the role of co-chairing the Scott Tech Ecosystem Implementation. That was the Logan report that came out last year. I'll be co-chairing that with the Cabinet Secretary. We've got our first board meeting this afternoon, actually, on the implementation of those ecosystem initiatives around infrastructure, funding and skills. And I also have a hat, I sit on the court of University of Strathclyde, just to declare an interest there. So that's my hats that I wear, and delighted to have the opportunity to be with you today. I was just going to cover over a few minutes, three key considerations, and then finish off in that, the final one of those with some provocations really that hopefully will stimulate sort of the conversation, which I'm sure will flow. The first one really around this, the role of universities, academia and industry in supporting the whole levelling up is around this new economic paradigm, which I think we're all familiar with. Four big sort of themes, all interconnected around the digital and data-driven economy, a health economy, beyond really health just as a social matter, but an economic opportunity and asset. The whole sort of net zero and sustainability considerations for the economy. And of course, then also some refer to advanced manufacturing, the reinvention of manufacturing and new types of manufacturing, the production going forward. And I think what's very clear to all of us, that requires a very different mindset than we've had in the past. It requires a kind of shaping. We can't predict how that economy is going to shape out, but we can help shape it. And that does require, and I think this is a bit of a challenge in Scotland, if I may say, being very candid, is driving forward, looking through the front windscreen rather than constantly through the rear view mirror, as the old saying goes. We tend to want to hold on to things that have been there in the past when really there is a new paradigm that's evolving. And that will require some strategic bets from both industry, academia and government in deciding where best to focus sort of effort. So that's my first consideration in terms of this new economic paradigm. Secondly, in terms of some, therefore, opportunities that I see emerging both from an economic and social, clearly embracing science and innovation in driving economic development. We've seen that, of course, in this pandemic environment, but of course there's something more from that. And Scotland in particular has got a real strength around biotechnology, life sciences. Many of you have seen the announcement yesterday about the BioHub up in the northeast there, Aberdeen, with a very sort of collaboration across industry, government, and of course academia. But of course we've got the BioQuarter in Edinburgh, alongside, for example, in Dundee, the Clinical Innovation Zone in Glasgow. So there's a real sort of strength around, obviously, where science and innovation is happening, and something maybe that can be built on in other areas. The second point on opportunity is around building on how we use research and development really at the heart of economic development. You could sort of say it's always been there in some parts of industry, but it's not in all areas. And maybe one of the examples I'd pull out here where you can see it happening is around data. Edinburgh and the Southeast region, this data-driven environment, sort of capital driven by the University of Edinburgh, I think is a great example. And Dave, with the informatics sort of excellence that we've got, is a real sort of excellence from a global point of view. The third thing about is, of course, then tackling the inequalities. And this is about that, a different mindset, a different sort of paradigm. And of course, we've had the various city deals across sort of Scotland, all at different stages of implementation, some fairly new, if you take like sort of Stirling, for example, maybe, but and that sort of region as opposed to Edinburgh and sort of Glasgow. But the development of community wealth building as part of that tackling inequalities is that sort of economic sort of leverage alongside the social benefits. I think the fourth one on this really is around the alignment of government policy. You've probably all sort of seen over this last, 8 months, we've probably had about well over 12 major economic policy documents from Scottish government that don't actually quite join up. And I've said this to the ministers, that don't actually interconnect, are not necessarily all sort of bringing forward a cohesive approach really to how bringing forward the right sort of actions and who's doing what. There's a lot of good intent, a lot of good sort of thoughts, but not necessarily followed through in actions. And that's particularly important in terms of the alignment with UK government. There is an exception to that, I'd argue, with an interest really in the tech ecosystem review implementation, the Logan review, about building that entrepreneurial tech ecosystem in sort of Scotland. But that's more of an exception, maybe. And the third area, the other area just on the opportunities is this co-creation opportunity of academia, industry, government. And the example very familiar with that really does sort of stand out and very much, I know the UK government have used this as an example, is the Glasgow City Innovation District in bringing together large enterprises, entrepreneurial enterprises, driven by the university, creating the right environment, bringing in the community, and really sort of driving forward different types of cluster development of activity around sort of quantum, around health tech, around space, around fintech. So they're some examples of, I see as opportunities with some examples. Let me just finish off my third point around enablers and some provocations, really. I've not already suggested some of these. So first of all, is there an opportunity here that we're much clearer on the clusters that Scotland wants to be famous for? The centres of excellence, rather than trying to be all things to all people, but talk about the particular areas of excellence and the clustering opportunity that comes from that. Mentioned around life sciences, bio. Of course, I've got an interest in sort of the digital financial services and fintech, but there are others, space may be another. Second point is collaboration. We talk a lot about collaboration in Scotland. There are some good examples, but is it really collaboration that's leading to outcomes? There are a lot of industry leadership groups that tend to be more around sort of a conversation rather than actually the talk rather than walk, if I may say so. So is there an opportunity to rethink the way we think about collaboration, the impact on supply chains, the role of procurement in that as an example, and also then alongside that community wealth building. The third sort of provocation is around sort of skills and talent, that alignment between the skills for this future economy and what the type of talent that's being developed in education, both pre-16, post-16. Is it really fit for purpose and going forward? And how do we make that? But also the bigger challenge around the retraining of the people in Scotland really for those future jobs. Obviously a key role here for Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Funding Council, and also about this issue around diversity and the diversity of talent and skills that we have across Scotland. Fourth provocation is infrastructure. Scotland really, is it really serious about embracing an infrastructure that's fit for a future economy, digital enabled? Yes, some progress is an example around Scotland 5G in some areas, but are we really creating a technology platform across all of Scotland, not just by broadband, but by the other capabilities that will allow entrepreneurs and businesses really to plug in and develop the science and innovation for the future? Big question mark on that, not just for Scotland, but also the UK. And my final point really is called money, funding. There is a huge amount that is now being pumped in and will be from Scottish government, UK government into science, innovation, these future areas. But to some extent, is it really, really fragmented? We do have the Scottish National Investment Bank now. We do have Scottish Enterprise with its funding. We have various other initiatives. In fact, if you look at across the 100 different innovation initiatives being funded by Scottish Government. You could argue, is it just trying to be too many things to too many people rather than this sort of focus? So they're the 5 areas I was suggesting as both enablers, but also provocations in terms of we could do a lot better from a place point of view in Scotland by maybe considering how best we progress those going forward. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a great introduction. Really appreciate that. And I was thinking it tallied really. I was sort of trying to think ahead of this conversation which areas we might touch on. And I suppose I thought of probably half a dozen broad areas covering funding, the policy environment, Scotland vis-a-vis the rest of the UK, Brexit and international connectivity perhaps, and then levelling up and the translation of research. But of course, as I think you set out very clearly in your remarks, even a lot of these things are very interconnected. So I don't propose to break down the conversation into sort of specific areas in quite that way. I wonder if I could start by addressing the broad question of levelling up, and in particular the role that universities can and should play in that agenda, which is very prominent in the wider UK political conversation at the moment. Always occurs to me that universities are almost unique amongst institutions of national significance in being very broadly distributed. You know, they're everywhere. The idea of the anchor institution in an area or a region that perhaps doesn't have an awful lot else to anchor it and to build that sort of economic growth is obviously very well discussed these days. But I wonder if I could ask in the Scottish context whether the dynamics are the same or different, and if they are different, in what ways. I think in particular, Stephen, of your comments about sort of the concentration of data, for example, around Edinburgh, and you can imagine Edinburgh and Glasgow being the sort of equivalent of the Golden Triangle in England, perhaps. Does anyone have some opening thoughts about how levelling up fits in the Scottish context specifically? Who wants to kick us off on that? Dave, can I come to you as you are in Edinburgh? You probably have first-hand knowledge of that concentration of excellence around data in particular.
Yeah, since you mentioned Edinburgh, I rose to the bait. So yeah, it is different actually in Scotland. I hope other folk agree with me. So compared to going down to the south, to the Golden Triangle, London, Oxford, and Cambridge, and so on. And the big difference is if you want to do something that's really convening, say around data, which is the bit I know a little bit more about. You do have to have culture change, because there isn't going to be much in the city, in the environment, that's really going to help you. At least that was certainly the case when we were starting off. And so I think university has a more prominent role in that particular context. There's more for a university to do. It has more of the components that it has to provide. It has to do quite a lot of the convening. Actually, convening is really important for these sorts of things. How do you get the critical mass together around something? And then it gets more complex around focus. What's the focus going to be? Is it an academic focus? Is it an industry focus? What's that then? How do you get people close enough, given that you don't have the gravity in the city itself? Edinburgh is quite a small city. So it's not going to do that sort of thing. Pretty much every city in Scotland is a small city. In fact, every city in Scotland is a small city when you look broadly. And so you're reliant a lot on whatever it is that universities do to give you that sort of attractor. I'll stop you. I don't want to monopolize things, and other hands are up. But that's my initial thought.
Thank you. Who else would like to come in on this sort of opening question of levelling up and how it sits within the sort of broader policy perspective, perhaps in Scotland? I can slightly broaden the question if that's helpful. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead if I'm missing somebody's hand.
Yeah, John, it's Brian Williams here.
Hi, Brian.
Hi. I suppose my comments really, I guess, partly because I'm coming from a traditional health background and public health, and I think maybe some lessons there. Because clearly, from a public health perspective, Scotland's had some unique challenges over the years. But at the centre of that are those levels of disparities within Scotland itself. So I was just thinking it's probably worth making the point at the very beginning of this conversation whether we're focusing specifically around the disparities between Scotland and then obviously London and the South East, other regions within the United Kingdom, or disparities within Scotland itself. I mean, the whole history of addressing, for example, health inequalities is that in our attempt to improve health, we exacerbate inequalities. So there is always this danger that if we, in seeking to enhance the sort of, whether it's health, productivity, wealth, earnings, whatever, educational attainment for Scotland in a UK context, what does that mean? And what happens therefore to the disparities within Scotland itself? Do we actually narrow those, or do we inadvertently widen those at the same time? And, you know, I think particularly for universities within Scotland, the size of our population, we can have a sort of unique relationship to our local geography. I think there is a role for us to be keeping an eye on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've finally twigged that there are lots of hands up. 18 months into the pandemic, I've worked out how to use Zoom, so apologies. I'll come to Judith next. Judith.
Thank you. I was going to make a very similar point, actually, because as a geographer by background, every time I hear place and levelling up, I get a bit twitchy, because what place are we actually talking about? And I think, you know, I think we need different levels of intervention, both sort of regionally, nationally, and very locally as well. And I think we haven't really grappled that kind of ecosystem either, or levelling. And I think one of the distinctive things about Scotland that really does get missed, not necessarily in the Scottish narrative, but certainly the UK narrative, is the remote and rural levelling up, because there's disparity within rural areas, and they tend to get lumped as sort of the rural area, whereas, you know, I think there's a much more micro analysis it shows that actually the disparities can be quite huge. So, you know, I think place needs disentangling, particularly in relation to levelling up. And, you know, do we really know what levelling up actually means? Is it poverty in disguise, or, you know, what is it, an old concept wrapped in new clothing? Or, you know, I think we need to really bottom that out as well.
Yeah. I wonder if Tim, you've got your hand up, and I'm sure you have a specific point you want to make, but Strathclyde, it's certainly not in a rural area of Scotland, but it has a particular, one of the earlier remarks was about culture, and Strathclyde has really, you know, very heavily majored on a culture of sort of applied research that does have industrial application, and has had huge success in that over the last decade or more, which must be cultural in part. That must be a sort of, you know, a sense that that's a very specific mission that you go out to go after. I wonder if you could perhaps touch on building that culture from Strathclyde's perspective.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, happy to do so. I mean, to some extent, this is, well, you don't start anything from scratch. So this is something that's always been there at Strathclyde. And of course, we look back to not only being a place of useful learning founded in the Industrial Revolution, but also being the UK's, one of the UK's first technological universities when we got our charter in 1964. And our principal and vice chancellor always refers to a slight period of amnesia when we'd forgotten about what we were really about, and of course under his leadership we've gone very firmly back to that, and I think the institution feels very comfortable with that, and I have to say that sits right across the across all the members of staff, independently of what kind of discipline or what faculty they're from. So people have been attracted by the sort of distinctiveness that I think we have. But that is the way we portray that is not just about the industrial work, because we also have these centres which are working in social science, for example, with looked after children. So it's the model that we try to apply in all sorts of different areas, you know, outside ones of direct economic impact. But I think it takes a lot of work, and I think one of the other things, to come back to the point that Stephen had made about what we're doing in the Glasgow City Innovation District, is it's not just about the university, it's about building up partnerships, because you have to recognise you can't do everything on your own, and therefore you need to bring in complementary and often slightly competing organisations who will also be you know, adding value to that ecosystem, and therefore making the system, as it were, more attractive. So that's really the kind of approach we've taken, and we've doubled down on it. We obviously look to build our industrial collaborations across areas of expertise, and indeed the collaboration with other parties. But if I may, I wanted to add a couple of other things, because the questions that you're asking, of course, are really good ones, very, very difficult to solve. But I think there's a couple of other things I wanted to bring up, because you started off just before we entered into this discussion, talking about anchor institutions and saying that universities are anchor institutions. So I think one of the questions here is what does it take to be an anchor institution in current society? And is that different from what it would have traditionally been? And I think it really is radically different. If you look at the way, for example, universities measured their economic impact and are probably still measuring their economic impact, it's largely in terms of the spend of students, the fees of overseas students, the salaries that get spent locally. And yet, if you think about the impact we're trying to have on society, that's utterly different. And therefore, those economic impact assessments are just measuring the wrong things, in my view. And I know various colleagues in economics who are trying to do their best to do it in a better way, but it's still a big pile of work, I think. So I think the point is that doesn't reflect our impact, or what we think of as being our impact. And it's very difficult to disentangle, because as I already said, you can't do any of these things and have an impact on the economy without working very closely with all sorts of others. And so disentangling the university's economic impact from everybody else's is basically impossible. But maybe I could throw a couple of other things in there, because it's been the question about levelling up has been raised, obviously, and that's also very closely related to the issues around just transition as we move forward under climate change and the strategies that we're adopting to go to a net zero society. And once again, those things require lots of difficult decisions and difficult trade-offs, where you can be doing things which get us to our net zero objective very quickly, but maybe not in a very just way. And that's almost a microcosm of the problem we're talking about. This conversation is mainly about that larger levelling up question, but actually it's the same sort of problem. There are lots of things we could do to get the economy up to be much more internationally competitive. The question is whether that works for everybody, and again, what do we do about it? So I think, again, although we're talking to universities here, SFC covers colleges as well as universities, and that's different from the rest of the UK. So one of the questions also we should be thinking about is, how does the university sector then work with a college sector to really fill in all those gaps and really make it a just levelling up, if I can kind of adopt some of that terminology from the climate change agenda.
Yeah, really, lots of really interesting points there, Tim. Thank you. I think the point about the potential tension between some of the agendas that are very prominent now, many of which do tie in directly to universities and indeed to R&D, whether it's levelling up, global Britain, net zero, digital economies. How you sort of go after those ambitions in sync rather than being in tension with one another is really interesting. Lots of other hands up. Michael, let's come to you and perhaps have more of an industry view on these questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. Some really interesting remarks. I've learned quite a bit already this morning. It's fantastic. I was really going to make a little reflection, and one thing which is, I think, quite revolutionary going on at the moment is, we're talking about levelling up, and levelling up is essentially a slogan which has come from an English political party, and it seems to be adopted and embraced in other areas. And I find this absolutely fascinating, because we've always had a place, as far as I've been grown up, we've had a place agenda in the UK, and it's been, and depending if you're in academia, you call it the Golden Triangle, and if you're outside of academia, you'd call it the Greater M25, and that was the place-based agenda. And it's not seen to be particularly a good way forwards. And so I think the question therefore becomes, well, who is responsible for levelling up? And we've already had the triple helix introduced by Stephen earlier this morning. And if we look at the role of what's the role of government in this? Well, they're responsible in some way for the macroeconomic situation. They're responsible in some way for major infrastructure, although that needn't necessarily be the way, because the canals and the railways were built as private enterprises many years ago. They are often held responsible for creating opportunities for regeneration. People talk about investment rather than handouts because they are more permanent. And then we have the whole gamut of devolved administrations, which in this context are extremely important, and the new phenomena of city mayors in other places as well. And then we come to business. And what's the responsibility here of business? Businesses are known to provide jobs, which require skills, some of which are created in-house, some of which are brought in. And it's often businesses who are involved in the day-to-day activity of transforming the opportunities for regeneration into world-class clusters. And of course, they don't do that by themselves, but they're pivotal in making it happen. And it's businesses that do the FDI, the foreign direct investment, such as is a key part of my job. And then we look at the first strand now of the triple helix, the universities. Well, I'm not going to sit here and tell my colleagues in universities what their role is and what their job is, because I think you're all very aware of your activities and your contributions to the levelling up. But there's a fourth area which I don't think we've mentioned in terms of the levelling up so far, and it comes outside the triple helix to say, okay, well, what's the role of the general public? What about the man in the street? The people who are not particularly involved in a business of any size, what's the particular role of them involved here? And I think there's actually a lot of activity which could be done, but the challenge is in how we bring them in, how we embrace them as part of, rather than as something which is to be provided for them, or some way in which they're to be external to the whole system. But I'll stop there. There's plenty more I could say, but there's a whole bunch of hands up. But my real question is, well, who owns the levelling up agenda, and does it really matter who owns it as long as we're getting on with it?
Really interesting. I'd like to come back to you a little bit later, perhaps, Michael, to ask about the sort of roadmap for public investment that really is required for private investment, to the sort of confidence of private industry to actually continue to invest in R&D as well, and whether there's enough of that. But before I do, Derek, could I come to you, and perhaps because you have a UKRI role as well, I'm sure you have a comment that you want to make, but if I could chuck in an extra thought. There was a recent report on the future of higher education by the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Committee, which pointed out that there were no Scottish institutions represented on the board of UKRI. And I wonder if you could just reflect on whether that's an oversight in terms of the importance of the Scottish perspective in UK-wide policy making.
Yeah, so I know the report you mean, and I think Ottilie Lizer was challenged on that when she done some roundtables in Scotland recently as well, and especially when she also went around the UK, she's been very active at engaging quite broadly. I'd say that the main challenge back, which I think would come from the UKRI board, would be that people have to step forward in order to get themselves represented as well. Most of those processes are very open processes and transparent, but if people aren't making themselves available or coming forward to join those processes, then it becomes very difficult just to normally kind of pinpoint somebody and pull them on. I think UKRI is open to definitely increasing the diversity of voices, which it is hearing from. I think that's something within EPSRC, we're very strong on kind of trying to influence that internally as well. I think we see the role of the kind of, so I would very struggle to say regions, because Scotland's definitely not a region, but in the context of if you're looking at the UK picture, kind of the various parts of the UK, I think it's essential that you have that inclusivity represented and you have that kind of strong voice from each of the areas, highlighting the key strengths. I think Stephen done a great job at the start, just kind of highlighting some of the key clusters which are forming in Scotland. And I think sometimes that narrative is what's really essential in order to drive some of this agenda forward. I think kind of looking at levelling up in place from the perspective that this isn't a new idea. We've spoken about this for decades in terms of disparities right across the UK. I think Scotland's unique in the sense that it's got quite a lot of regional disparity within Scotland itself. And when you think about the UK as a whole, you're not going to have one model which is going to suit everybody. Nor should it, because each of them have got different strengths, and I think that needs to be championed as well as kind of looked at in terms of how you can help and facilitate that moving forward. I think Dave struck on it quite well when he first made the comment that my personal belief is that universities play an essential convening role and actually pulling a lot of those strands together. Michael kind of started to speak about people in the kind of local area, but the civic engagement that universities facilitate in order really delivering for those local skills needs and the capacity which can be built is essential for where any businesses are going to look to invest. And it's a key factor in order to drive that kind of foreign direct investment as well, which overall will be essential to what the government is hopefully trying to achieve through having a strategy like this. I think for me, still levelling up in place is still quite opaque in terms of what the outcome which is sought. And I think we need a bit more clarity on that. And I think it's also coming at a time when I think Stephen mentioned 12 policy environments from the Scottish government. I think the UK government have also issued a similar number at the same time. So it's a very congested landscape, and there is a real need for connectivity. So it's ensuring that we don't just kind of look at where we need to grow, but we also look to celebrate where we've already got great success. And in Scotland, in the Central Belt, we shouldn't be looking to level down either in order to try and level up across other parts in order to bring them up to the same level. I think we have to kind of show how we can get engagement and connectivity from where we've got success around the UK. Yeah, thanks very much for that. John and Brad, you've been very patient, but I'm coming to you. John, let's come to you next. Well, you're on mute, John.
I've just done that. Thank you. I'll be super brief. I mean, I was interested when you were framing out the initial kind of contextual piece about the relationship of the different parts of the UK. Scotland's the north of the UK, obviously, and then we've got this kind of political dynamic between the respective governments in either Cardiff or Belfast, but certainly between Westminster and Scotland. And we've got this kind of slightly antagonistic political dynamic at the moment. But the levelling up agenda is got to be politically important for the coherence of the UK to see Scotland as a place that can be invested in by the Westminster government. And so that relationship between Scottish government, UK government, Research England and the Scottish Funding Council, because the Scottish educational sector, John, is a much more controlled community than perhaps we see south of the border. I mean, it is wonderful to be on this call because so many of the faces are familiar, because we regularly meet. But I think the important fact that colleagues have already made is that even though we might frame Scotland as a place, as Judith said, in the north of Britain, it is a very heterogeneous place. And we also then talk about the Golden Triangle as being this kind of desire zone and inward, capital investment in that triangle. But the Central Belt is literally the geographic flatlands between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and it has the two big anchor institutions of Glasgow University and Edinburgh University, and then the rest of the Scottish sector. So I think there's really some important understanding to be done about the differences of scale that apply, whether it's northeast Scotland or whether, as Judith mentioned, as we get into the increasingly more remote parts of Scotland and the northern parts, then they are very separate kind of entities from the Central Belt. And then so those local political relationships have to be unpicked. And then that's where we come into the partnership basis. So again, just in terms of historical context, as Tim mentioned, we have an ecosystem of innovation which has innovation centres, it has accelerator institutes, it has specialist institutes around advanced manufacturing. But the SFC has also, over the last decade, fostered collective, collaborative research networks through its pooling initiative, which were funded for a significant period of time, but are now under part of the kind of comprehensive review that SFC have done on the other side of the election. And so there's a bit of uncertainty in Scotland as to quite which way the SFC is going to fall, as to whether we'll see more sustained investment in that framework that's been kind of established over the past decade, or whether we're going to see new initiatives coming into play which will maybe break up some of the traditional patterns of strength that we have, and maybe play more to aspects of Scottish geography that we, in terms of place, that we've not yet explored. So thank you. I was just trying to kind of not repeat what others had said, but I do think that that larger political dimension needs to be framed into the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really interesting. And I, if we have time, it might be interesting to get on to some of the specific political aspects of funding in Scotland as well. You know, even moving away from R&D to the sort of free tuition and the extent to which that limits the ability to cross-subsidise in research and so on. There's a sort of big political question around that as well. Right, we're crossing the bridge, I think, now from Dundee to St Andrews. Brad, let's come to you.
Thanks, John. And I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said. And I agree with an awful lot of the comments of colleagues on the call. I guess just a couple of quick thoughts from me. I think that Judith's question about what does leveling up mean is a really important one. And I think for me, it's really simply about how, you know, meaningful opportunity can be provided that's inclusive and it's diverse. It cuts across regions, but also other types of constituencies. And I think in Scotland in particular, universities are without question uniquely positioned, just given the quality of universities, the fact that it's a particularly outsized sector, I think in Scotland. And there's just absolutely world-class research and clusters all over the country as well. But for me, there's also a pretty significant demand and supply question, which a lot of colleagues have touched upon. And whilst I think that universities are unquestionably anchor institutions and important economic drivers within their regions, and will continue to be so, and I wouldn't want to downplay that at all, if it doesn't sit within a wider set of structures and frameworks that can take advantage of that, then for me, the question is, you know, there are limits to what universities can do as anchor institutions that are driving that leveling up agenda. So you can have a big pharmaceutical company, for example, that invests in a center of excellence at a Scottish university, but then if the manufacturing and a lot of the value add goes elsewhere, then it's not actually providing the meaningful opportunities more widely in society. So universities have to sit, and particularly in Scotland, where they are such a significant force for R&D and innovation, they have to sit within wider frameworks, whether that's industrial strategies or it's incentives that attract investment and businesses locating facilities and activities that are going to provide those meaningful opportunities for a much wider constituency within the country. That's really pretty critical. Otherwise, there are just limits, I think, to what universities are able to do if those other things aren't sitting around them. So that wider ecosystem is really important. I think that universities can play a really important convening role as well. And we know that our university, which hasn't necessarily been traditionally known for even how we bring together our academic side and industry, we're putting all kinds of different activities into place to become much better at that, as are all universities. But once again, there are still going to be limits around the extent to which you get those spillover effects that I think that really then begins to have a really significant and positive impact on that leveling up agenda. So I guess to summarize my point, I think that universities are critically important for the leveling agenda in Scotland, but they really have to sit within a much wider framework that involves government, it involves the various incentives that are in place for investment. And particularly if Scotland is more than a place-based location for just science and research and innovation, it also has to be a really significant place-based location for investment in the sorts of activities that are going to provide meaningful employment and wider opportunities for communities more generally.
I wonder if I could just ask you, Brad, I think you have a particular focus on international strategy at St Andrews as well. And although this has been touched on briefly, it is another facet to this discussion. There was a University of Scotland report recently which called for a commitment to sort of post-Brexit international scholarships to ensure that Scotland could continue to attract top talent to its universities, but also there's the new Saltire Research Awards that look to sort of boost European collaboration. Have you seen any significant change in Scotland's ability to attract the best internationally since Brexit? I suppose the pandemic is another factor on top of this that perhaps makes it difficult to know what has affected what. But what's your view of Scotland's kind of allure internationally now versus 5 years ago or whatever?
I mean, my view is we're referring specifically to post-Brexit, in effect, aren't we, and the impact that may have. I mean, my view at the minute, a lot of it's pretty opaque because of the pandemic. I think we'll have to wait and see how these things play out. But I've been a member of a couple of different groups that have just been reflecting on what the post-COVID higher education sector looks like, and the degree to which things move online or place continues to be important. And of course, for Scottish universities, place is critically important. And my view is that provided that there's reasonable immigration schemes for people being able to come easily, that the funding environment still remains relatively attractive. The reality is that and I don't know if colleagues would disagree at all, but I think that when you have clusters of excellence, that continues to attract clusters of excellence. And so certainly when we've been even recently advertising for posts, we haven't seen any significant decline, for example, in applications from colleagues in Europe wanting still to come. I think that the UK generally has absolutely world-leading universities, and Scotland in particular has extraordinary areas of excellence, and that will continue to attract colleagues from around the world, provided that the facilities that attracts them continue to be here, the collaborators and the networks that colleagues want to access continue to be here, and obviously that the investment and the research funding continues to be very rich. So I'm relatively sanguine actually about how universities in the UK will perform, provided that there isn't acts of stupidity that usually has to do with visas and immigration systems and these types of things. Yeah, thank you. James, maybe I'll come to you. You may have a view on that in terms of inward investment as well.
Yes, thanks, John. And just the segue into international there, I thought I'd pitch in just to reinforce and agree with what Brad just mentioned about that broader context within which universities operate most successfully, when there's not just a cluster of academic expertise and excellence, but also an industrial critical mass of industry within those regions. And I'm not sure if there's anyone on the call from Aberdeen, but I don't know if it's been mentioned. And I think it's an excellent example, again, to add to the list of the areas where Scotland has particular expertise that were set out in the initial comments on life sciences, bio and fintech and space maybe. But I would also say subsea engineering, deep water engineering is one of those examples, with Aberdeen in particular, that we have got a critical mass of international players, and I think that shows the impact that FDI can have on creating that context. And I would say it has to be part of the ongoing effort to create those ecosystems in the various regions of Scotland that we're discussing. And obviously the student population is also a route towards encouraging more FDI, and it's a cycle. And I just hope that again, post-Brexit and all of the UK and the Scottish government's broader trade and investment strategies help to complement that environment, because there's lots of question marks over, what global Britain means and how open the UK economy more broadly will remain to be to foreign investment. In particular from China, obviously, is my area of specialism, but I would certainly concur with Brad and his comments. I won't say anything further at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the problem with political slogans is that you then have to define what they actually mean. I think levelling up is a classic example of that. Judith, let's come back to you. I may follow up whatever remarks you'd like to make on the current point with returning to your point about the sort of disparities as well between rural and urban areas, but over to you.
Just a few points, what people have said actually. One is, Brad mentioned spillover effects, and we keep thinking about, oh, these ecosystems develop out of clusters. There's actually evidence to show that clusters don't necessarily work everywhere. So we need to be cautious about, you know, and what is the evidence that actually we are actually getting the outcomes we really want. So I think, you know, a cluster approach needs to be looked at, because it's easy to say these words, but we all remember the trickle down kind of scenarios that didn't work, and we don't want to fall into those kind of traps. Stephen at the beginning challenged us to think in different paradigms, and levelling up is a dirty word actually in Scotland and with government. So, you know, I do think that we need to think carefully about how we translate that. I mean, well-being is one of the key things that the government are really keen on promoting. And it's like turning the whole thing on its head and coming back from, you know, what social outcomes do we actually want and how do we get there, given climate change, etc. So rather than economic drivers, starting with the social kind of aspects and social innovation and the role of a social innovation, which often gets left out in, I think, some of the discussions, particularly the ones I've been at in Scotland. I mean, we have huge potential here in the STEM subjects and so forth, but the social aspects and social science and arts and humanities disciplines very much don't get a look in some of these kind of discussions. So I just wanted to turn it on its head there. The other paradigm change I think we've hinted on, but just want to push that a bit further, is Celtic connections as well. Wales and Scotland are going in different directions to England. Why are we looking to England all the time? Should we be really working with our neighbours in other devolved nations? And what about the Nordics? Because we have a lot more in common with some of the Scandinavian countries than we do in some respects to some things south of the border. There's huge opportunities there for collaboration partnerships, which are already going in some of these universities. And if we're going to create a narrative, should we be endorsing that? I've got vested interest here, I should say. The only other languages I speak are Welsh and Swedish, so I'd be pretty happy to align with either of those.
It is an interesting, really interesting point though. There was a recent HEPI report, wasn't there, on the role of R&D, and it was about levelling up. And the focus there was very much on greater inter-regional collaboration between universities. I think they used the example of what it's got a great name. It's something like the Northern Gritstone Partnership, which I think is Leeds, Manchester, and Sheffield. The idea is you bring all these universities together, attract big international investment in particular to fund science and I think tech startups in that case. I mean, should Scotland be doing more of this? Is it already doing plenty of this? Does anybody have a particular view on this? Brian, it's probably not the point you were going to ask, but since you have your hand up, I'll come to you.
Well, I'll try and somehow cleverly link it in. I was actually going back to something that Michael was asking, which was really about the role of the public. And actually, since we're talking about Scandinavia, I think, you know, some of the success there, particularly within Norway, northern Norway, was around empowering communities as much as anything. So for me, I think if we're talking about this levelling up issue, then there's the role of the public is both in defining at a regional level what that means for them. And I particularly like Judith's point about this is more than just economics, but it is about broader forms of well-being, you know, educational attainment, it's a real patterning of that. And I think it's absolutely crucial that the public are involved at a regional level to decide what does that mean for them. So, for example, going back probably about 30, 35 years, my first ever research I did, I was based in Cambridge, and I was sent to Easterhouse in Glasgow to do some research on loan sharking. I had no street credibility at all as an Englishman from Cambridge in Easterhouse, but I can distinctly remember that one of the women I was interviewing getting quite irate with me and saying, look, all you're doing is just looking at the problems all the time and you're sort of describing these, you know, the difficulties we live in. What you really should be asking us is how, given all those difficulties, how the hell we managed to survive so well. And she'd shifted that from a sort of into an asset sort of focus about the identity that she wanted. And I think some of the danger so far across the whole UK conversation about levelling up is this unidimensional language about regions which have been left behind, which really doesn't help inward investment. It certainly doesn't help sort of retaining your youth population. And yet, if I look at something like the Highlands and Islands, yeah, they may have issues about migration. They may have issues about certain elements of economics. But when I look at measures of well-being, they score incredibly well in terms of life satisfaction, low levels of anxiety, and a whole range of these. So for that region, what identity do they want? And what does the public want in terms of defining them? There, they may want to focus in terms of levelling up, building on their assets, as opposed to somebody constantly focusing on those negatives. So I think there's really something important about the role of the public at a regional level. And the second element, I think, about the role of the public is just asking the question about where innovation lies in contemporary society. And it isn't always in the industry, and it isn't always in universities. I think increasingly it can be within third sector. It can be certainly in very small businesses as well. And I think there's a role for us to look and redefine innovation in quite clever ways, to think, okay, that innovation's sitting there, but universities can work closely with that to add value and build on that at a regional or even a national level.
Thank you. Yeah, really thought-provoking. Stephen, should we come back to you?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to pick up a couple of points with some examples, really. I think, and Brian's points and Judith's points around this levelling up. I think we're very clear what we don't mean is not trying to make everybody the same and go to the lowest denominator, really. It's not about that. And I think the point about it really is about a kind of inclusivity, really, in making sure that everyone is participative, back to Brian's point, in the actual economic development, creating this new sort of paradigm rather than others being left out, or people knowing they think know what's best for citizens or the public. So this opportunity around kind of combining economic and social outcomes hand in hand rather than seen as separate, and that participative aspect around citizen engagement is something where we do have some good examples. And Brian, on your point, really, Money Advice Scotland is a great example of using innovation really to understand the problems and then look about how you use that in innovation to develop new ways of addressing those problems around debt, around financial exclusion. And there are other examples. And to some extent, maybe some of the city deals have tried to do this. I think it's been a bit clunky, and sometimes you go into the traditional group. So I think there's a whole agenda opportunity for universities to provide this environment for citizen engagement into the laboratory of experimentation on the new areas of innovation based on problem statements with the intellect and with industrial sort of participation. So there's an opportunity there, I think, that's really important. The other point I was going to make really was, I think it really is quite sort of key. This isn't about trying to make levelling up everywhere the same, but it is about different parts of Scotland sort of saying, well, where are our areas of excellence? And it was touched on earlier, I think, by someone about Aberdeen and the whole sort of energy transition and the assets that are up there in the northeast and being leveraged into the whole net zero economy. You've got a great example out at Stirling with Stirling University with the development of the Scotland International Environmental Centre, combining obviously the use of environmental data, 5G, involving industry with the university and the excellence there. So it's probably just how do we bring through those areas of excellence so that everyone's trying to be everything to everyone, but actually that diversity of that innovation across Scotland is seen as a real rich family, but they're brought to life by real examples rather than just talk generically, we want more economic outcomes, more jobs and better social outcomes. It's got to be based on actual real sort of the industries of the future.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. I'd be interested too in whether the last 18 months and the pandemic has perhaps slightly changed the tone of the conversation or attitudes towards what success looks like. I mean, Judith talked a lot about it not just being economic impact, and we had the point that was well made earlier about the economic impact statements that universities often put out being pretty one-dimensional, really. But perhaps the last 18 months has slightly changed the context in which this conversation needs to be had. Dave, let's come to you.
Yeah, just to pick up the question you asked about startups and that kind of culture. Should we be doing more of that? I think that's that's something we do a lot of, and it's an example of one of these things that probably lots of universities would do. But I think there's a different thing that people don't often talk about for universities that's becoming really important now, and it links into leveling up, and also to the way you orient yourself when you're building that sort of culture. Because there's a different kind of leveling up in the world, and it really matters if you're in a university. And the leveling up is international, and it's around the big international challenges. So I think one of the things that's done for us is it's made universities be more. I feel more and more every month like a bookie. You're putting bets on things that are quite risky from an academic point of view, but enable you to engage with these big international challenges. Healthcare is a brilliant one. If you look at healthcare, then if your objective had been to create a vaccine, well, it's probably Oxford that's going to do it, because they made that bet a long time ago, and it's paying off for them. If it was gene sequencing for ICU patients in COVID, then Edinburgh is better positioned, because we placed that bet a long time ago, and we had the networks to do that kind of thing. And you only do that if you understand that things have got leveled up in a different sense internationally. These are big problems. They're interdisciplinary. Actually, universities are one of the few places where you can make these big interdisciplinary bets, but you can only make a few because you're resource limited, quite tightly resource limited in UK universities. And so universities are making those kinds of strategic choices. And so that's a value to industry and to the public sector, because they're I would claim universities are the only places that can make those choices. The clue is in the title. The universities, they're very broad typically, so they can go across and make these interdisciplinary bets. But if we get it wrong, or if we don't align with industry or the local regions, then the wheels start to come off. It doesn't last for very long, and money gets wasted. So I think that's probably something where we miss a trick, I would say nationally. We aren't very good at doing that sort of alignment and understanding the bets that we've made.
Thank you. I do think one of the, I was talking recently to Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, who has written a book recently, which is called something like Moonshot Capitalism. She's very keen on these grand challenges, and she was making the point that the vaccine had showed a way of working between government, universities, researchers, and industry that was pretty. I mean, it was sort of unique, but also it was very powerful when it worked together. And I suppose that does speak to the point that both universities and industry need government to play their role in providing that stability, that roadmap, particularly around funding, but not just funding. And that's really the catalyst for confidence and commitment in terms of private investment as well. Michael, maybe I'll come to you. I mentioned this earlier, something we could perhaps pick up later. Is there enough of that sort of confidence from a sort of private sector perspective in terms of, you know, the government, where the government's going, the roadmap for funding? And I suppose from Huawei's perspective, you've also got the additional political factors which are difficult to contend with too.
Wow. Is there enough confidence in business at the moment? I think it depends which business you're relating to. And certainly if you look at the political landscape has changed enormously in the last few years. Brexit, and I still don't know what that means completely, is making a huge impact, and the whole of so-called global Britain is repositioning itself and making new alliances and old alliances around the world as well. So that's I think it's something which is evolving, and certainly in the new global Britain we have made some moves towards trying to create some, let's call it independence in how we define our own way forwards and deciding who we're going to work with. So we've had initiatives like, for example, the National Security and Investment Bill, which has gone through. There is a whole new department been set up in BASE, which has the sole objective of helping universities make good quality decisions in choosing their international partners. And so these are radically different from anything in the way things were made before. And I think the way in which these new regulations, rules, laws, and indeed new units are going to be operated is going to have a key influence on the way in which not only we, but also our partners perceive what the good road is and how we can have confidence for the future as well. But if you continue to look at other pieces of business, well, we're kind of seeing a bit of an economic bounce back at the moment. And if you said to me 3 years ago, well, 2021 is going to get 8.5% GDP in the UK, I'm not even sure I would have bothered laughing. It would have just been so inconceivable. But that is the kind of figure we're getting. But it does seem there are some sectors which are very, very good at bouncing back. There are some sectors, mostly heavily tech-enabled sectors, which are having the strongest bounce back and have been most resilient. And resilience is a subject we haven't mentioned yet here at all through the pandemic. But there's other sectors that have taken an absolute hammering over the last year and a bit, and they're not yet bouncing back. And this readjustment, combined with the other factors, is leading to things like labour shortages. So you've probably heard about there's a shortage of people in the hospitality industry. Why? Well, they all lost their jobs at pretty much the same time. And while furlough provides some kind of stability, it's certainly not going to create a career for anybody. So people have left that sector. There's a shortage of lorry drivers, we're hearing on the news at the moment. And we can make our own ideas about why that might be the case. And there's a big shortage of ICT people at the moment. And that comes as no surprise to anybody. And that's despite the fact that we've been supporting IT skills for as long as we've been around and have our own ICT academy. But there's still a big shortage of ICT skills in the country. And this is something that's really interesting, because I think previously we'd seen shortages in particular small numbers of sectors of the economy from a business point of view. But now we're seeing a shortage of people at very low paid jobs in the hospitality sector, and people on what's very normally well-paid jobs in the ICT sector at the same time. And so I think in the whole of this, we've got to throw in the bounce back and the preparedness, and we should consider how much the bounce back may affect not maybe in the national, but certainly the sub-city level levelling up, as there will be people who will be better off and people who will be worse off over the next year or two as well.
Yeah, thank you. And it was mentioned earlier, but it's something we haven't touched on at length yet, the sort of retraining, skills, upskilling piece as well, which is something I think universities are all, if not pivoting towards, having to think much harder about what part they play in that. Tim, you have your hand up. I'll come to you.
Yeah, thanks. I want to pick up the point about both the bets, the point that David made, and then Michael's points about international networks, because I think, you know, David's absolutely right. You place bets as an academic institution in developing different bits of capability, and you never know what's going to come out of that, really. Because some of those bets will be in areas where actually some other academic institution somewhere else in the world has placed a similar but slightly different and ultimately more successful bet. You can't do a lot about that. But what we have across the UK's brilliant universities is huge numbers of bets that have been placed. And really, for the strategy for UK PLC and you know, within that Scotland, is that we have to be able to identify those bets which happen to be in the right area and just accelerate them really, really quickly, so that we can gain the advantage of you know, the economic benefit that's to be driven from that. And so the question is really not, you know, when you've got an excellent science base as we do, the question is really how do you create structures which now allow you to accelerate that through to application, and how do you draw in the additional capabilities that you need for that? And we're typically talking about areas which are really, really specialized. And so it's difficult to find all those bits of specialism that you require in order to accelerate what was a good bet in the first place. And often what you need is actually bits of international collaboration to achieve it, because again, we're also specialists within academic institutions. So you know, the place agenda actually sits, and it's maybe it sounds slightly ironic, but it sits very firmly within a framework of both national and international collaboration, both for academic institutions and for businesses, because we can't be collectively successful at an international scale unless we use all those different capabilities. And I think the continuous manufacturing crystallization initiative that we have at Strathclyde, which has engendered the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre, is a good example of that, because although there's a core team at Strathclyde, actually they've had huge amounts of EPSSE support, for which we're very grateful, Derek, and loads of different universities in the UK, in Scotland as well, but in the broader UK, have been involved, and actually various international universities. And the companies that are investing in that are also internationally based, because they don't necessarily yet have a manufacturing base, but they're going into it because they can see the argument and that it's taking a leading role in challenges that they all have. Now, that links actually very nicely to the reason why it's such a timely initiative, and therefore why it attracts so much support, is because it actually links into other worries about resilience and security of supply. We need to onshore our pharmaceuticals manufacturing, because things like the pandemic demonstrate that you need as a nation to have resilience. We already knew that because of challenges previously about managing the quality of manufacturing over the entire world. So there's already a move towards onshoring, but that's been accelerated really quickly. So the reason I'm explaining this is because I think A, it's a great centre that we need to talk about more, but B, because it illustrates all of these different points that Dave and Michael were making, but also how, the context, things like the need for resilience, suddenly put wind behind those kinds of initiatives and make them really, really significant at a national scale. So it's not really actually achieved what it needs to do in terms of jobs yet, but what it has done is it's given us a unique capability in Scotland that has the capability to translate into jobs manufacturing new drugs in Scotland. And is that going to create loads and loads of jobs for people in these let's say left behind areas? Maybe not. But I think that's more generally the case in these kinds of areas, that a lot of the things that universities can do rely on basically on that trickle down effect that we talked about earlier on. They'll attract more tax-paying companies, more good, well-paid jobs, therefore more tax revenue. That makes the state more sustainable. That's how it helps in general. Within the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland, actually, we do have programs for apprentices and links with colleges, so that does some of that. But in general, it's a bit more difficult to work, I think, through universities to really reach those areas. But may I'll stop there. But I think that example hopefully shows the way all these different pieces come together in a specific case.
It does, yeah, absolutely, and a really interesting description of the impact that universities have in that way. Derek, let's come to you.
So yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the point about skills and internationalisation. I think well, to be completely honest, obviously the levelling up agenda and the place agenda is very much targeting how the UK can kind of gather from these left behind areas, but ultimately the UK government are seeking for international competitiveness across the UK. And that is the whole point of the R&D system. They wanted the UK to be recognised globally as a force within all of these areas and to be leading the way. So I think what we need to get better at, and it's something that I kind of constantly champion within our own organisation, is recognise where we do have a piece of local excellence and how that really represents at a national level. And I think we probably don't do that enough currently. So I think, as Tim mentioned, the kind of Centre for Continuous Manufacturing, I think if we look across to Edinburgh to the Data Driven Institute, Dundee with the life sciences and the kind of biomedicine hub that they're creating, all of these pieces, they may not be directly funded by UK government initiatives initially, but we should still be championing them to the same level about as a doorstop for where international kind of opportunities can arise and where they can come and kind of access that gateway into the UK as well. And I think we do need to think collectively how we can do that better. The other aspect around skills, I think without having the capacity in a location, you're just not going to attract the businesses. Like without having the skills and the people ready in order to take up the opportunity, it's just not going to be possible. Within EPSRC, we've spent the last 12 months engaging with businesses and universities around place and thinking about what kind of dynamic we need to include in our kind of future looking strategy to kind of harness the opportunities for our communities. And the key things that business kept coming back and telling us were business, well, larger businesses will irrespectively not really kind of focus on a location, but they'll go to where there is niche capability that they can exploit in terms of skills and needs, and then grow a base from there. And that's what will drive the investment. So I think where we also need to kind of pitch this conversation is, what does the industry landscape in the UK actually look like? Because in Scotland, it's primarily SME based. Across the UK, it's primarily SME based. And we need to be thinking about the initiatives which allow these organisations to grow to certain levels, and recognise that sometimes it's a success if they get bought over, and it's not always a failure if they just disappear. And kind of, because I think there is a need from the kind of narrative that Bayes pushes as well, to think about these companies always need to turn into the next Google or the next Microsoft. That's not always a kind of long-term possibility. And yeah, I just kind of, Scotland's got some unique infrastructure in place as well, and I would kind of also highlight SFC are in a very constrained environment in terms of their funding model, but I think the money that they put into the pooling mechanisms and the innovation centres have created a really collaborative infrastructure which potentially doesn't get exploited enough when kind of funding proposals are being made at a European and kind of UK level. And that's something that I think that they've done very well in order to get in place, and I think it could be utilised to a greater kind of extent.
Yeah, thanks. It does strike me throughout this conversation that actually, I mean, it's one of the old chestnuts about the UK, isn't it? That we're great at basic research, not so great at the translation. It's always said. But actually, the many examples given by all of you really show that there's a huge amount going on. Yes, perhaps the spin-outs are more likely to be SMEs than they are Google or Facebook, but nevertheless, you know, lots of fantastic examples. That said, and perhaps Derek, staying with you, as you have the sort of UKRI hat, the new chair of UKRI, Sir Andrew Mackenzie, has obviously a distinguished private sector background, particularly in oil and gas. And he told MPs at his pre-appointment hearing that he did still think that one of the most pressing challenges for research was technology transfer. I mean, is he right? Is that still the kind of key thing that perhaps Scotland and more a UK question here needs to get better at?
So obviously I can't speak for Andrew's own perspective on that, but I can say that internally within UKRI it's completely recognised that we do need to get better at the translational aspects. But I think it's also kind of providing the opportunities for that to happen in a much more kind of accelerated manner where the support is in place. So there is a lot of work ongoing within UKRI. We've got a director for the commercialisation of research, who's very much kind of been working with a lot of different key sectors to understand those pathways. And to think about the kind of mechanisms that we can put in place, not just to fund that activity, but to support it. Because I think there's a lot of really good examples, like I champion most of the universities around this table, where they're already got infrastructure in place in their own universities doing this really well, where UKRI could learn a thing or two by kind of thinking about how you could replicate some of those models at a wider level. But we are definitely on that traction where we need to be thinking about how can we be more proactive at pursuing some of those opportunities. I think there is that common kind of, UKRI was formed for the basis of bringing all the ecosystem together, and bringing Innovate UK within that partnership really should be enabling a bit more translational activity coming through. I think EPSRC, we're kind of uniquely based because we're very technologies driven. There's a natural pathway into that kind of funding. But yeah, I think the innovation strategy is a really key kind of strategy for thinking about how this gets enabled in a much broader sense for the UK. And I think it's a unique opportunity, especially post-Brexit, post-pandemic, to think about what we've learned. Because we have created a brand new digital infrastructure in the UK by having to move everything virtually from the pandemic. And I think we should really be focusing on the success that we've made of that. I know a lot of sectors, primarily service sectors, have really struggled because they don't have the kind of footfall and they don't have the labour market. But there are a lot of sectors which have really taken advantage of that opportunity and really started to kind of create a niche for themselves. I just wanted to add one bit, John, before. I think we talked before about the vaccine, and I think, yeah, it's a great success story, but it really hits home that there needs to be long-term investment in fundamental research in order to enable that translation. If you don't have that long-term investment, that translation is never going to come regardless of how many initiatives and things created, because you don't have that platform base. It becomes boom and bust. It's a 4-year cycle of money going in a door, but then nothing else coming out of it after that. So we really need to be thinking about how we can really ring fence that. And I take Judith's point earlier, it really needs to be about how you have the users of that research in place and how you think about the whole actual ecosystem, because I've been working a very cross-UKRI role in helping with the response to the pandemic, and the value of the humanities and social sciences in terms of the response to the pandemic, it can't be underestimated, because it's without those kind of factors being fully influencing the policy making has really kind of driven forward a lot of the measures which have been put in place. And it's something that I think we need to be hugely passionate about. The UK's got a great humanities base as well, which sometimes does get overlooked. And I think we are massive champions of that in UKRI as well.
Definitely, yeah, completely agree with that. We're probably sort of coming almost towards the end of our time and wrap up shortly, but on that last point about sort of the need for long-term investment, I always think Anton Muscatelli is excellent on this, and he wrote a piece recently, I think it was for the Times, where he talked about the sort of 3 pillars that were key to economic recovery following the pandemic, being innovation, infrastructure and skills, and universities having a key role in all of them, but also pointing out that, as he put it, there were worrying cracks appearing in the innovation pillar. Now, I think this was shortly before the resolution that was found to the Horizon Europe funding panic at the 11th hour, finding the cash down the back of the sofa. But clearly we are, the UK government has been very vocal about, science, superpower status and so on and so forth. There have been some concerns that the rhetoric perhaps isn't always matched by reality, but equally, I put this to Joe Johnson at in fact, it was the Huawei academic salon that we had a month or 2 ago. And Joe Johnson was not just on his brother's behalf, I think, but as a former minister, very, very, he was actually quite cross, as he sometimes does, Joe Johnson, about the idea that there was any backsliding on science. And in fact, the government was hugely committed. It runs through the integrated review like a stick of rock, he said, like the writing for a stick of rock. And that the government commitment was 100% on science, that industry and universities could feel confident in the long-term uplift towards the 2.4% of GDP. I wonder, as a group, do you feel confident in that? Do you think the sector is now feeling that actually, you will be getting that flow of funding, the uplift that you've been promised, or is there still any reticence around it? Anyone brave enough to venture forth on that?
I'll
Derek?
go first as a funder and then exclude myself, because this is very much about the ecosystem. I think as a funder, I think we need to believe in the promises that government are making, and I think we're working a lot with government on the policies that they're trying to create to make sure it's representative of need, but also just kind of highlighting that UKRI won't be the only vehicle in terms of how this is going to move forward, and it shouldn't be. There are other kind of ways. Obviously, we are the best vehicle to use, but there are other means by which the money has to come into the system as well. But that mission towards 2.4% won't be realised just by the UK government contribution, and it's massively dependent on us creating the capabilities for having that foreign investment, and not just foreign investment, but kind of global investment. So I think we need to recognise that industry's got probably much more of a significant role to play than it currently gets kind of championed on, and we need to be supportive of industry in order to enable that to take place, in order for these kind of objectives to be realised as well.
Brad, let's come to you.
I was just going to say, John, whether the rhetoric will match the reality, we'll have to wait and see. But I suspect that they probably are committed to it. I think that where my observation is that they just don't know quite how they're going to direct it, or where they're going to direct it to, whether that's universities or it's it's regions or whatever the vehicle might be, industry. I think what does worry me a little bit, though, is that there does tend to be an awful lot of talk about it being directed increasingly to STEM, which is important. But I do worry a little bit that within this sort of drive, that the arts and humanities will be left behind. And I think that whatever future evolves, and I'm not a big believer that that you can always predict what the winners are going to be, although I think that the discussion about making bets is a really important one, although bets are normally made on things that exist, as I think Tim has pointed out before. But I do think that whatever future materializes, that it is going to have to be a balance between, you know, creativity and some of the other types of things that comes through a good solid arts and humanities basis, as well as STEM, and how these two things can come together in really innovative ways. And so, so I guess just to summarize my point, I think they probably are committed to it. I don't think that they know how they're going to funnel or direct some of that investment and that drive towards that 2.4% of GDP being spent on R&D. But I do detect that there is a definite shift towards STEM, and it does worry me a little bit about what that means for the arts and humanities.
Yeah, important point. John.
Just a super brief observation that, you know, this is a period of incredible turbulence, and I think to Derek's point about the coalition of activity that needs to help fuel that 2.4%, I absolutely agree. But I think government does need to be held to account in terms of making sure that its actions match the rhetoric. And I think the loss of the ODA funding, particularly going back to Dave's earlier point about, you know, global Britain, you know, commitments to the global south, to the sustainable development goals, I think that unilateral withdrawal of those commitments has done a massive damage to Britain as politically, I think, in terms of its influence in the world, and in terms of being an honest broker and an honest partner. So I think you know, I've always held Joe Johnson in the highest kind of regard from I think it being a person of integrity, but I think it's kind of hard to defend the government's recent actions and out of this period of tremendous turbulence, when, you know, the industrial strategy has been quietly left behind. And when we see the emergence of the green recovery narrative, that's to be welcomed, but it's hard to see clear actions that will deliver that 2.4%, at least from where I sit. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to mention Horizon Europe, because obviously one of the big uncertainties at the moment is the consolidation of that funding. And because I don't know where the discussions are on that, but of course, if that's not consolidated in the way that gets brought into the overall budget, then we could still end up with a lower budget in total. And I think we're not out of the woods yet in the political relationship with Europe there. There are some exit clauses, and you know, unless the political relationship stabilizes a bit, I think there's going to be some further uncertainties around that. But that's an important part of what contributes to 2.4%.
Absolutely. Dave, let's come to you.
Yeah, I think the translational question is really, there's really a compact on both sides that we're working through, actually, and if we hold our nerve, it might work out well, and if we don't, it won't. So on the university side, I think it is to do with culture. You're either interested in having translational research, in which case you will put that right alongside your foundational research and treat each equally, or you're not. And we do, so I know a little bit about the experience of that, and this actually doesn't exclude the humanities. If you go to Edinburgh and look at what we spent on data, Futures Institute is in College of Humanities. That thing's going to end up costing about 130 million to put up. It'll have about 1,000 people in it, and it's on data. So I think it's a question of how you interpret what you're doing with the intersection between the sciences and the humanities, in my view. But whatever you do, you're looking for a culture change to do that kind of translational research. That's a big thing for a university. And then for the government side, I think we want consistency. At the moment, it seems very inconsistent, to be blunt, actually. You're never quite sure who's paying for what and how many times particular promises have been made for funding and where and who's pulling the strings and what's coming out. I understand why it's difficult. These are chaotic times, but that's what we're looking for: consistency, protect the fundamental academic base and lead it through to technology transfer. Then we hold up our end in the universities by doing the culture change that enables translation. That for me is the compact.
Absolutely. Well, that was a really fascinating conversation. An hour and a half has shot by. Have I missed anyone? Anyone want to make any brief final remarks? If not, I will say a massive thanks to all of you. Huge thanks to Stephen for kicking off the conversation. Huge thanks to Michael and colleagues for bringing us together, and to all of you for your contributions. I found it fascinating, and look forward to reading the write-up when it comes as well. But thanks to all of you. Charlotte, shall I hand back to you?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'll respond once the article's written up. I'll send it around to everybody so you can have a read of it. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.